No? I have to hold it down? Oh, there we go. Great. Let's try this one more time. The Subcommittee on Immigration and Citizenship will come to order. Without objection, I will serve as the substitute subcommittee chair in the absence of Chair Zoe Lofgren. In addition, without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the subcommittee at any time. We welcome everyone to this morning's hearing on oversight of the Trump administration's border policies and the relationship between anti-immigrant rhetoric and domestic terrorism. We especially welcome all of our visitors who are in El Paso from out of town. Welcome to the safe and secure U.S.-Mexico border. Before we begin, I would like to thank President Heather Wilson and the University of Texas at El Paso for the warm welcome and for allowing us to use this space for this very important hearing. Dr. Wilson, did you want to say a few words?
Please. Madam Chairman and Mr. Chairman, Chairman Nadler, members of the committee, welcome to UTEP. Bienvenidos a la Universidad de Texas en El Paso. UTEP es una de las 10 universidades de investigación de alto nivel en Texas. UTEP is one of only 10 high-level research universities in Texas. We are the only Research One university in America that is predominantly Hispanic. But that's not all. Over 23,000 students study on our beautiful campus every day. Tenemos más de 23,000 estudiantes aquí. And with an annual tuition of about $9,000 a year, we're one of the most affordable universities in America. Cambiamos vidas y damos oportunidad. We change lives and provide opportunity. Despite the recent events, we do this in one of the safest cities in America, El Paso, Texas. I hope you take time to enjoy our beautiful campus. We're very happy that you're here. Welcome to the University of Texas at El Paso.
Thank you for your hospitality, Dr. Wilson. We're very grateful for it. I'd also like to thank Judiciary Committee Chairman Gerald Nadler and Immigration and Citizenship Subcommittee Chair Zoe Lofgren for agreeing to hold this very important hearing here in El Paso and for allowing me the tremendous privilege of chairing it. It is my honor. And many thanks to my colleagues for making the journey to my hometown to be here with us today. I'd like to recognize a special guest in the audience, one of the heroes and survivors of the Walmart massacre, Chris Grant, who tried to distract the killer and as a result was shot twice. We are very lucky that he is alive, and we are so happy that you are here with us. Chris, would you mind standing up so that we can recognize you? And finally, to the panelists, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your wisdom with us today. We look forward to your testimony. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. Unfortunately, it is only too fitting that this hearing is being held in El Paso, a place that has had to endure the target painted on our backs because of anti-immigrant rhetoric, and a community that has been ground zero for the Trump administration's cruel immigration policies. Anti-immigrant rhetoric is on the rise today, and it is inflamed by President Trump. Criminals, rapists, drug dealers. That's how then candidate Trump described Mexicans when he launched his campaign. The rhetoric continued into his presidency. In a meeting in the Oval Office, he described some African nations as, quote, shithole countries when discussing whether those nationals were worthy of immigration relief. He's called immigrants animals, and the rhetoric has only escalated over time. One study found that President Trump has used words like invasion and killer more than 500 times to describe immigrants. And the president's rhetoric influences public opinion. Recent polling from the Pew Research Center found that 57% of Republicans and Republican-leaning independents say that the U.S. risks losing its identity if America is too open to foreigners. This number is up 13% since last year. Even more frightening is the xenophobic mania that is whipped up at the president's rallies when he uses the words that dehumanize. Many of us were absolutely stunned when at a Florida rally in May, the president rhetorically asked the crowd what he should do with migrants who crossed the border. One of the president's supporters yelled, "Shoot them," and the president laughed. Research indicates that counties that hosted a Trump campaign rally saw a 226% increase in reported hate crimes over counties that didn't host those rallies. Well, President Trump hosted a rally in El Paso in February. And on August 3rd, a domestic terrorist drove over 600 miles to this safe and secure community where people of color are the majority, 80% of us are Latino, and where immigrants make up a quarter of our population. The terrorist confessed that he came to El Paso to, quote, target Mexicans and immigrants. He killed 22 people, injured dozens, and left an entire community in mourning. El Paso has a long journey ahead of her. Minutes before his attack, the terrorist posted a racist screed on the internet decrying, quote, an Hispanic invasion. Those words echo words President Trump has used in the past. Words have consequences. Policies have consequences. It should be no surprise that a president who calls immigrants animals can justify treating them as such. Children have died in U.S. custody. There's been horrific overcrowding in Border Patrol facilities. There's been force feeding of adults in custody, in fact, happening now, happening today in El Paso at the ICE Processing Center. And there has been continued traumatic family separation. This administration has admitted to using cruelty as a deterrent, and that includes forcing migrants to wait their turn to apply for asylum in Mexico, a country that is not their own, in what's called metering. And once they request asylum, they are forced back under the so-called Migrant Protection Protocols, or MPP, to wait for their day in an American court. In the El Paso sector, migrants are left to fend for themselves in Ciudad Juarez. Through the casework assistance my office provides, we are aware of abuses with MPP. Vulnerable populations who should ostensibly not be subjected to MPP are being sent back, including Mexican nationals, pregnant women, and migrants with severe mental disabilities. Those sent back suffer harassment and danger. One father of a young family was kidnapped and beaten while trying to find diapers. Another young woman was kidnapped and raped by Mexican federal police. In my 8.5 months in Congress, it is clearer than ever that this administration governs with cruelty. We must understand the human toll of these policies, the inhumanity and the indignities that immigrants suffer as we consider funding for the departments that execute those policies. And as for the anti-immigrant rhetoric, for many of us, those words have become a matter of life and death. It is now my pleasure to recognize the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you very much. I want to begin by thanking my esteemed colleague, Representative Escobar, for welcoming us to El Paso, for her commendable service on the Judiciary Committee, and for her deep commitment to representing the people of El Paso with strength and integrity and compassion. I also want to thank the University of Texas at El Paso for hosting us today for this very important hearing. For 2.5 years, the Trump administration has issued an endless series of draconian immigration policies, some of which have been implemented, and some of which rightfully have been enjoined by the courts as contrary to our laws. These policies have had a devastating impact on immigrants here in the United States and also on those fleeing for their lives and seeking protection along our southern border. At the same time, this administration has used racist and inflammatory language against immigrants. The president has referred to immigrants as rapists, thugs, and animals, and has described the arrival of asylum seekers as, quote, an invasion of our country, unquote. Language such as this is dangerous and can have tragic consequences. The perpetrator of the horrible mass shooting here in El Paso last month used the term invasion in his hate-filled manifesto and later told law enforcement officials that he was targeting Mexicans. I wonder what one of the sources of his ideas was. This community has not only borne the brunt of the administration's chaotic border policies, it is also grieving from the violent consequences of pervasive anti-immigrant rhetoric. Although I regret that we must continue to confront these issues, I cannot think of a more appropriate venue for this important hearing. When I was in El Paso earlier this year, I toured several ports of entry, observed overcrowded Border Patrol facilities, and visited Immigration and Customs Enforcement detention centers. I also talked with several nonprofit organizations in the area and heard firsthand accounts as to how the humanitarian crisis is unfolding. Instead of addressing the root causes of migration, the violence that is going on in a few Central American countries, the threats, and competently managing the challenges at our border, the Trump administration has chosen to dehumanize immigrants and to exploit this crisis for political gain. In doing so, it has violated American laws and undermined American values. It has emotionally traumatized many children who have been torn from their families and held in unconscionable conditions. And it has promoted dangerous rhetoric that contributes to a climate of fear among immigrant communities and that at times has served as inspiration for violent attacks against immigrants. The administration's inhumane treatment of migrants must be viewed in the context of broader problems, deep within the culture of our immigration enforcement system. These problems were aptly illustrated when racist and misogynist posts in a closed Facebook group of nearly 10,000 current and former Customs and Border Protection officers were recently exposed. Posts that joke about migrant deaths and that disparage congresswomen. The sheer size of this group and the fact that the chief of the Border Patrol, Carla Provost, was a member at one time of this group indicates a culture of disdain and cruelty toward immigrants that has deeply infected the agency and that can only be exacerbated by the bigoted and hateful rhetoric emanating from the White House. When coupled with this rhetoric, it puts the safety of immigrant communities and those who are perceived as immigrants at even greater risk. This all reminds us of the anti-Semitic, anti-Italian, anti-Irish, anti-Catholic, and anti-Asian rhetoric that has stained our country at times in the past and gave rise to racist immigration laws in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There must be accountability for the policy choices that got us here. The Trump administration has repeatedly claimed that the abhorrent conditions and policies at the border are necessary to manage increased numbers of asylum seekers. But let us be very clear about this. We have the capability to safely process these migrants and to manage the situation with compassion rather than with cruelty and racism and illegal actions. Instead, the administration has opted for policies that compromise human safety and that exacerbate the crisis. Policies such as locking up asylum seekers and denying them bond hearings. Policies such as the so-called migrant protection, in quotes, protocols, which have forced tens of thousands of asylum seekers into unfamiliar and often dangerous communities in Mexico. And metering, which arbitrarily limits the number of people who can apply for asylum at official ports of entry each day and forces them to enter irregularly between these ports, subjecting them to further danger. I am eager to hear from each of our witnesses today, and I thank them for offering their perspectives on the administration's border policies and the disturbing rise of anti-immigrant rhetoric in this country, including from this administration. I thank the chair for arranging to hold this important hearing, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. There will be two panels of witnesses for today's hearing. The first panel will discuss the relationship between the rise of anti-immigrant rhetoric and domestic terrorism. The second panel will focus on the Trump administration's border policies. I will now introduce the first panel of witnesses. Joanne Bernal joined the El Paso County Attorney's Office in 1993. In 2009, she was appointed as the first female county attorney in El Paso's history and is currently the only female attorney board certified in civil trial law in El Paso. Prior to joining the El Paso County Attorney's Office, she served as an assistant attorney general in the Law Enforcement Division of the Texas Attorney General's Office for 6 years. As county attorney, Ms. Bernal supervises approximately 100 employees, including 44 attorneys who practice both civil and criminal law. Over the course of her career, she has demonstrated her commitment to ensuring that all victims of crime, including undocumented victims, are treated with dignity and respect and protected with the full force of law. Ms. Bernal was born and raised in El Paso and received her undergraduate and law degrees from the University of Texas at Austin. Next, we have Dr. Mónica Muñoz Martinez. Dr. Muñoz Martinez is an award-winning author, educator, and historian. An Andrew Carnegie Fellow, Ms. Martinez is the Stanley J. Bernstein Assistant Professor of American Studies and Ethnic Studies at Brown University, where she is also a faculty fellow at the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and the First Generation College and Low-Income Student Center. Her research specializes in histories of violence and policing on the U.S.-Mexico border, among other subjects. Last year, she published a book entitled The Injustice Never Leaves You, Anti-Mexican Violence in Texas, which analyzes many of the trends we will be discussing in this first panel. Professor Martinez is also a founding member of the nonprofit organization Refusing to Forget that calls for public commemorations of anti-Mexican violence in Texas. She received her BA from Brown University and her PhD from Yale University. And we have Alejandra Castillo, who has served as the Chief Executive Officer at the YMCA USA since August of 2017. Previously, she served in senior leadership positions in 2 presidential administrations and is an experienced attorney working in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. Ms. Castillo served as Senior White House Advisor for the Office of National Drug Control Policy under the Clinton administration. In 2014, she was appointed by the Obama administration to serve as the National Director of the Minority Business Development Agency, becoming the first Hispanic American woman to lead the agency. Ms. Castillo received her BA from the State University of New York at Stony Brook, her MA from the University of Texas at Austin, and her JD from American University. We welcome all of our distinguished witnesses and thank them for participating in today's hearing. Now, if you would please rise, I will begin by swearing you in. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record show the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. Please note that each of your written statements will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time, our staff will be timing you on an iPad, and will raise the iPad when you have 1 minute remaining. Ms. Bernal, you may begin.
Thank you. Good morning, Honorable Chair Escobar, Honorable Chair Nadler, and members of the Judiciary Committee. Welcome to El Paso. We are very honored to have each of you here today. El Paso has found itself in the midst of a perfect and terrible storm. As you know, a little over a month ago, a man drove into our city to kill our citizens because of the color of our skin. The hatred that motivated that man did not start that day. There has been a confluence of factors that precipitated the hostility that we saw in our community. This is a hostility towards immigrants and towards brown people, but that hostility must be viewed through the prism, frankly, of governmental conduct. We are all familiar with the hateful rhetoric, discussed somewhat this morning, that had permeated the 2016 presidential campaign, beginning with the declaration that Mexico was sending criminals, rapists, and drug smugglers to the United States, and proceeding with a constant barrage of rhetoric about the need for the border wall. The reference to an invasion from the South can only make people fearful. Trump's administration's actions, putting children in cages, separating children from their parents, holding immigrants in conditions that are inhumane, reinforces his dehumanization of brown people. A common thread is that brown people, Mexicans, Central Americans are bad, are to be feared, are to be hated, are to be caged, and to be sent back where they came from. In February 2017, barely a month after the president took office, federal immigration officials entered the El Paso County Courthouse, proceeded to a court specifically designated as the Protective Order Court, and detained an undocumented victim of domestic violence who was seeking protection from her abuser. The victim was removed from our courthouse by federal officials and detained initially on immigration violations. The very public and aggressive arrest is consistent with this president's urgency to treat immigrants like criminals and justify the need for the border wall and the detention of immigrant families. It was a stunning and unprecedented event in El Paso. A victim is deserving of protection regardless of her legal status, and a criminal is deserving of prosecution regardless of whether he has abused a citizen or a non-citizen in our community. The incident went viral, and immediately victims who were scheduled for a protective order hearing began to cancel their hearing dates because they were afraid to come into our courthouse. The incident has had a real and demonstrable chilling effect in El Paso. What we experienced in El Paso were federal agents with a perceived license to take any steps they deemed necessary to round up undocumented victims. This perceived license for aggression comes from the top. And while federal authorities were ramping up the rhetoric and conduct against immigrants and Mexicans, the anti-immigrant rhetoric on the state side was similarly front and center. Only months after Trump took office, the governor of Texas signed a bill into law that is commonly referred to as SB 4. At the time, SB 4 was considered the most dramatic state crackdown yet on so-called sanctuary cities, and it came at a moment when the Trump administration had sought to do the same at the federal level. SB 4 essentially prohibited local governments from doing anything that limited local law enforcement officers to enforce immigration laws. SB 4 contained provisions that criminalized a public official's actions in interfering with the enforcement of immigration laws. It was marred by hateful rhetoric from the starts. One of the authors of SB 4 is on record saying that one of the reasons and the need for the law was to get bad people. The author of the bill explained on the record that bad people were the illegals who needed to go home. The law was not directed at felons, at drug traffickers, at human smugglers. It was directed generally at illegals. El Paso has been ground zero in the immigration battle. Thousands of refugees from Central America have found their way to the United States through El Paso. Both state and federal governments have sent an influx of military and law enforcement into our region, and the militarization of our border is our new normal. It has been publicly reported that the shooter in El Paso complained about the Hispanic invasion. Note, please, that it was not an immigration invasion. It was not an illegal invasion or an undocumented invasion. It was not a complaint about drug dealers or human traffickers. It was reference to Hispanics. The bigotry and hate in the form of speech and government conduct have fueled the flames of violence, and we unfortunately are the targets. And this simply should not be the role of government in our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bernal. Dr. Muñoz Martinez.
Good morning. Honorable Chair Escobar, Chair Nadler, and members of the committee, I'm so honored to be with you here today. Thank you for holding this urgent hearing. I'm a historian, author, and a professor. My book, The Injustice Never Leaves You, recovers a period of racial terror between 1910 and 1920, when Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals were targeted with racial violence. Hundreds of people were killed, men, women, and children. People who witnessed this era frequently referred to it as la matanza, the massacre. There are three urgent historical lessons for today. First, 100 years ago, anti-immigrant and anti-Mexican rhetoric fueled an era of racial violence by law enforcement and vigilantes. Second, racist rhetoric shaped immigration policies and Jim Crow laws targeting Mexican Americans. And third, legislators and the judicial system failed to correct the course of history, and violence continued throughout the 20th century. This was an era of state-sanctioned racial violence. Politicians and law enforcement used anti-Mexican rhetoric to fuel fear of the border and fear of border communities. People who looked Mexican were described as inherently violent, un-American, as bandits and murderers. Even in death, victims were criminalized by police reports and in the media. In 1919, U.S. Congressman Claude Hudspeth of West Texas described hordes of Mexican bandits just south of the border as an ever-present threat. He publicly justified state police officers shooting Mexicans on sight. He testified under oath, quote, "You've got to kill those Mexicans when you find them or they will kill you." But politicians went beyond rhetoric. They funded the militarization of the border, and Texas governors offered their pardoning power to state police who committed crimes. Law enforcement and vigilantes enjoyed a culture of impunity. Three cases show that neither class, age, gender, or citizenship protected people who looked Mexican. In September 1915 in South Texas, two land-owning American citizens, Antonio Longoria and Jesus Bazan, met with state police to report that they had been robbed. While returning home, the two men were shot in the back by a posse that included a state police captain. There were no investigations. No one was ever prosecuted. In January 1918, a group of Texas Rangers, U.S. soldiers, and civilians traveled to Porvenir in West Texas and arrested 15 men and boys. The Texas Rangers then massacred the 15 prisoners in cold blood. Despite investigations by Mexican and U.S. governments, no civilians or officers were ever prosecuted. In April 1919, Concepcion Garcia was shot by a U.S. soldier when she crossed the Rio Grande into Mexico to return home. A military court found the soldier guilty of manslaughter, but months later, President Woodrow Wilson ordered that the soldier be freed and reinstated for military duty. Concepcion was 9 years old. There are thousands of records that shed light on this history thanks to politicians, sheriffs, diplomats, and attorneys, Anglos and Mexicans, that tried to end this violence. Sheriff William Bond, for example, publicly testified to the murder of innocent people and tried to have the state police removed from Cameron County. Many of the leaders were surveilled and intimidated. In 1919, State Representative Jose T. Canales, the sole Mexican-American elected to state office in Texas, led a congressional investigation into abuse by the state police. He himself received death threats from law enforcement. That legislative committee concluded that the officers were, quote, guilty of and are responsible for the gross violation of both civil and criminal laws of the state. And yet, officers were not prosecuted for crimes, and there was no admission of guilt or wrongdoing by the state. 100 years ago, elected officials heard accounts of injustice taking place in the name of national security, and they heard calls for change. They could have heeded the calls for justice. Instead, they chose to maintain the status quo, ensuring that racial violence and hate would continue. Moreover, racism took shape in Jim Crow laws that segregated and disenfranchised Mexican Americans and in restrictive immigration policies. Today, I urge you to learn from these lessons of history, to heed the ongoing calls for social justice. History teaches us that failing to act will ensure that suffering, violence, and death will continue, patterns of violence will persist, and the impact will be felt for generations to come. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Ms. Castillo.
Good morning. Good morning. Buenos dias. Chairwoman Escobar, Chairman Nadler, and members of this esteemed committee, thank you for the introduction. As CEO of YMCA USA, I represent the oldest and largest women's organization in the country. We are on the ground in El Paso, Texas, in Dayton, Ohio, and in some 1,300 communities across the nation. We have been at the forefront of the most pressing social movements for more than 160 years. Today, I appear before you to testify about the critical issue of anti-immigrant rhetoric and its link to domestic terrorism. I'd especially like to thank Chairwoman Escobar and her dedicated staff for their leadership and service to the people of El Paso. I'm pleased to be joined here today by Dr. Silvia Acosta, CEO of YWCA El Paso del Norte region, as well as members of her board and staff. YWCA El Paso has been part of this community since 1909. Dr. Acosta and her team have been working with numerous partners as this community struggles to provide respite and return of dignity to migrants caught up in this immigration crisis, as well as to help heal an entire community after the aftermath of August 3rd mass shooting. I am forever grateful for their deep commitment in advancing YWCA's mission of eliminating racism and empowering women. Just this week, Dr. Acosta shared with me that increased anti-immigrant rhetoric is directly impacting our youngest generations. She shared that children attending YWCA El Paso's after-school and early learning academies are afraid of going to jail or being killed because of their Mexican ancestry. Many also express anxiety about their potential deportation of their parents, regardless of their immigration status. These are children as young as 4 years old. And across the country, in our YWCA Seattle, King Snohomish County, Maria Wilcox tells us kids are afraid to go to school because of gun violence. No child, I repeat, none, no matter their race, age, or gender, should go to school and live in a climate with these growing fears. Each day across this great nation, across this country that I love, YWCAs get up and do the work of supporting those most impacted by racial and gender-based violence. Given our expertise and extensive work in communities, I want to highlight 3 critical areas this morning that are further detailed in my written statement. First, words that we utter do matter, and the acts of hate, terror, and dehumanization are fueling an epidemic of domestic terrorism that is linked to a deep history of racial violence in our nation. Today, the vitriolic anti-immigrant rhetoric is unfortunately not new. We have a long history of creating walls to push out those that we deem other. To demonize, stereotype, and marginalize, waves of European immigrants in the 19th and 20th century experienced this. And today we are singling out people seeking refuge and asylum by calling them names and putting them in cages. We've been down this road before, and yet we find ourselves repeating history. We can do better. Second, our communities are reeling from the trauma inflicted by a confluence of gun violence, racist rhetoric, misogyny, and gender-based violence. These are the interrelated issues that lie at the heart of America's surge in domestic terrorism. Make no mistake, El Paso, Dayton, and so many other mass shootings are acts of domestic terrorism propelled by racism, misogyny, and easy access to weapons of war. These correlations are a key aspect of the crisis that can and must be addressed. Third, when communities are traumatized by racist rhetorics and the violence of domestic terrorism, community healing is imperative. Acts of violence both cause and compound trauma, particularly when communities are already grappling with racism and social economic challenges. YWCAs are part of the fabric of communities hardest hit by domestic terrorism, and we stand in lockstep with many nonprofit organizations throughout the country who are picking up the shattered pieces. In El Paso, YWCA is working with Hispanics in Philanthropy, Las Americas, and many other partners. Together, we are all bringing our collective resources and expertise to bear to address this crisis. Our hope with these strong collaboration is to model strength in numbers, to show our country how the partnership of many not only brings us together, but also makes a difference in how the community is prepared and able to respond to tragedy and human crisis with compassion, dignity, and with a focus on improving outcomes for all. Madam Chairwoman and Mr. Chairman, today we find ourselves at a pivotal juncture as we search to define and defend the values that constitute the soul of our nation. Through education, accountability, and swift action by Congress, we can take steps towards ending these systemic acts of violence in our communities and give true meaning to our nation's motto, E pluribus unum. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of YWCA, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you all so much for your testimony. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. And my first question is for Ms. Bernal. Ms. Bernal, you are an El Pasoan, you live here, you were born and raised here, you work here. I think what is critically important, for me anyway, about this hearing is that America understand the consequences of what is occurring. Would you please share with us, with as much detail as you possibly can, what you are hearing from your constituents and from your clients about the massacre at Walmart and the words that you talked about that did not fuel the I don't want to give the individual an excuse. The domestic terrorist is responsible for his behavior, but that have fueled the crisis that we are in this country.
Thank you, Chairwoman Escobar. You know, there's been a real and palpable change in El Paso. For those of us that grew up here, I think anyone will tell you that El Paso is one of the least racist, least bigoted communities that you could ever live in. We don't really seek skin color, and maybe it's because so many of us are so brown, right? We don't see skin color. Everyone that has grown up in El Paso has intermarried with non-Hispanics and have children and nieces and nephews who we call, you know, half Hispanic, half white. We don't see that. The point that's been driven home from the shooting is that we realize that the rest of the world sees us differently. I am a mother of 2 children who are half white, and they were raised proud Latinas. For the first time in my life, it occurred to me that they might be a little safer because they don't look as brown as me. And that's a really sad thing to acknowledge. The constituents that I speak to are they're still frightened. They're still afraid. You know, many people are still afraid to go to Walmart, to crowded malls. I know people that are afraid to go to memorial sites because they feel like they're a target. You know, there's a lot of Hispanics in one place and they're sitting ducks. So it's changed the way we feel about our security in such a safe city. And it's unfortunately opened our eyes to realize that others don't see us the same way we've always seen others. That somehow, you know, the rhetoric directed at Latinos and at immigrants and at brown people implies that Hispanics are just a little less American, that we're not quite as American as others in the country. And it's been a very eye-opening and really sad, I think, experience for many of us in the community and many of my constituents who feel that this new normal is not the way, it's not the way that we used to live, and it's not the way we want to live.
There is an irony in what is happening that I'd like for you to help folks understand. If there's this national fear being whipped up by the president and his enablers about immigration, but it really is El Paso and other border communities that have been feeling the impact of significant numbers of families who are knocking on our front door. So we are the ones who, more than any other community in the country, really feel the consequence of large numbers of immigrants knocking on that door. How has, in the face of hysteria elsewhere, how has El Paso chosen to react?
You know, as a prosecutor, I want to be clear that I don't know anyone in this border community that supports open border policies that would allow criminals and drug smugglers and people that are designed to hurt this country come into this country. So first and foremost, I think that we need to dispel this idea that because you're Hispanic, you want open borders and every criminal from any part of the country to come into our community. We want a safe country too. And what we need is comprehensive, reasonable immigration reform. We can't make that happen locally, but what we can do is when thousands of refugees and immigrants show up at our doorstep, we can feed them, we can clothe them. One of the untold stories, I think, is the incredible amount of love and support that El Pasoans stepped up when the rest of the country and frankly policymakers wouldn't change policies or wouldn't direct resources. El Pasoans stepped up. There were thousands of El Pasoans who made meals, who put packets together with toothpaste and toothbrushes, who donated clothes, who drove people to the airport to help on a humanitarian level, recognize that although we may not be able to change immigration law, we can make sure that the United States remains a humanitarian bastion where people can come and they won't be vilified. And at least in this community, El Pasoans opened their wallets and their hearts and reached out to them.
Thank you so much. My time has expired. I now recognize our esteemed chairman from New York, Representative Nadler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Professor Muñoz Martinez, in your testimony, you gave us a very helpful history of some of the anti-immigrant and anti-Mexican violence in Texas. Could you tell us how did the political rhetoric of the time contribute to the culture and shape immigration policies and practices of that era?
Excuse me.
And I apologize. We have to remember to keep speaking into the mic clearly and loudly so that Facebook picks us up.
Okay, great. Great. Well, I could give an entire lecture or teach us a class on that. But really quickly, I will say that there were many features that created a context that allowed violence to continue. On the one hand, this racist rhetoric represented Mexicans to people across the country who'd never encountered a Mexican before. And the misrepresentations of people by calling them criminals and by calling them un-American and presenting them as people who did not deserve the protections of American citizenship meant that a nation, for the large part, agreed with that. And so there were people in communities along the border who demystified that just by the very nature of who they were. They were educated, they had been in the border regions for generations, they were active in politics, and so some of the racial violence was specifically to dismantle this border community and remove Mexican Americans from having any economic or cultural or political power. But this violence also corrupted law enforcement and the judicial system. And so this meant that when politicians and leaders dehumanized people, that police also dehumanized them and didn't recognize their humanity. And during this period, Texas Rangers and local law enforcement were understood to be judge, juries, and executioners.
You said this period. What period are you referring to?
In the early 20th century, so 100 years ago, during this period of racial violence that has been referred to as a massacre of anybody who looked Mexican, whether they were American citizens or Mexican nationals. And so people were denied due process, they were denied the presumption of innocence, but that racist rhetoric also shaped policy. So it wasn't just vigilante violence, it was violence by law enforcement and violence in the law. Jim Crow laws were passed to disenfranchise Mexican Americans from voting. Laws were passed to discourage intermarriage, to make it illegal. And anti-immigrant legislation was passed to restrict immigration, like the 1924 Immigration Act that was inspired by eugenicists and by nativists. And so I am horrified when I hear current administration members referring to that act as a model. It should give us all pause and call us to action to look at the immigration policies that are being enacted and the harm that's being caused. And one of the other historical patterns that has reemerged that is important to consider is the disavowal of suffering of humans that was so pervasive in the early 20th century that was very effective in allowing the national public for these acts of racial violence to continue. People actually celebrated it and thought it was progress. And so when you have the dehumanization of people and the denial of rights of those people is quite easy to take place. And so now that we have a national conversation and awareness of the inhumanity that's taken place in our name, in the name of the US, we have to act.
Thank you very much, Ms. Castillo. You have, let me just say, when you refer to the 1924 Act, which was racist, anti-Semitic, etc., I remember watching and hoping for its repeal when I was in high school, which is when it happened, 1965. Ms. Castillo, you have frequently spoken out against various Trump immigration policies, such as the zero-tolerance family separation policy, and the administration's stance on access to asylum for individuals with credible fear of domestic violence or gun violence, or gang violence, rather. These policies that bar access to entry for vulnerable individuals have contributed clearly to anti-immigrant rhetoric in America. Can you discuss how these policies specifically target women and victims of violence and how that shapes perceptions of immigrants here in the country?
Thank you for the question. Yes. So we know data that we have from the United Nations and other sources. We know particularly El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras have both first, third, and seventh place respectively in female homicide. And the reason that we as YWCA are so keen about this is because many women try to move from one village to another, fleeing their domestic partners because of fear of gender-based violence. So their first approach is to flee their villages, but most of them are flee the country in search for a better opportunity for themselves and for their children. So the issue of domestic violence is real. We have to take it very seriously. And I will tell you, I will draw on the history of the YWCA. We stood on Ellis Island, helping immigrant women coming from Europe, because we knew that even then, the issue of domestic violence and gender-based violence is something that's so keen for women. So we are true to our mission, then as we are today. And that is why when we see the changes in policies, when we're seeing women fleeing from Central America, looking for asylum and refugee, and our country has now changed the way we treat women, we have to stand up. So these issues are critically important. And I will take this opportunity to also ask Congress to reauthorize VAWA, the Violence Against Women's Act. It is shameful that we haven't done that yet. And this permeates not just for women in the US, but how we treat women and how we stand up for women.
Thank you. You know, of course, that this committee reported the reauthorization of VAWA and that the House passed it. And we're waiting breathlessly for the Senate's breakneck pace to get to this issue. My time has expired. I thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I now recognize my distinguished colleague from Washington, Representative Jayapal.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all so much for being here and for your testimony. I think it was you, Ms. Bernal, who in your testimony talked about the perceived license for aggression. And Dr. Muñoz Martinez, you spoke about dehumanization. And the chairwoman in her opening comments talked about all the different ways in which this president has given that license for aggression. I would just remind the audience that this is a president who actually selected a portrait of Andrew Jackson to grace his office. This is Andrew Jackson, pro-slavery president who perpetuated genocide against Native Americans. So this is the context in which we are working today. And the threats of white nationalist terrorism have been clear really for some years since this president was elected. Hate groups have expanded, they've become more organized. We've seen the data for that directly. Perpetrators of hate crimes have routinely invoked the president's name in an uptick of hate violence, so drastic that scholars have actually dubbed it the Trump effect. And recent mass shooters, obviously, you know better than any, have had these racist and anti-immigrant agendas. And yet the administration has actually done nothing. They've, in fact, done the opposite. They've directed the FBI not to focus on countering this and rooting out this kind of white nationalist terrorism. So I wanted to start with Ms. Castillo and also Ms. Bernal. I'm going to ask both of you to weigh in on this question. Ms. Castillo, you have members and organizations in 1,300 communities across the country. You've talked about the effects of this on your members. Ms. Bernal, you've also referred to this. Can you talk about the direct ways and impact of that fear on your community members, on your organizational members, in terms of, say, the services they seek, the ability to go to school, you know, whatever impacts you're seeing? Can you help this committee understand exactly what those are?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for that question. In my capacity as county attorney, one of the things that's most difficult is to quantify, right, the negative. How many victims are not coming forward? Very often, I think people that don't live in predominantly or communities with a high immigrant population, don't realize that most families are mixed, right? And so very often what you see is, in our situation, when we had federal authorities in the courthouse, it wasn't just undocumented immigrants who were afraid to step forward to seek protection. We had U.S. citizens who had filed for protective orders, but who were fearful to come into the courthouse because one of their children might be undocumented, one of 3 children. And so what we are seeing before the incident, we were seeing a pretty steady rise of about 15% annually in the number of women seeking protective orders. Immediately following the raid in the courthouse, there was a sharp decrease within the next 6 weeks to 2 months. And since then, for the last 2 years, we've continued to see a steady decrease in the number of people availing themselves of protection that they're entitled to under the law. And so what we are afraid of is that there's no national statistics that would suggest that domestic violence is on the decrease. And so what we know is that we have victims that are not coming into the courthouse to seek protection.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Castillo?
Congresswoman, let me tie these 2 communities, El Paso and Dayton. And the Congresswoman knows I was here 36 hours before the shooting occurred. And within 24 hours after the shooting in El Paso, Dayton happened. I'm going to bring the story of Dayton because Dayton had the Ku Klux Klan targeted Dayton. A hospital shut down in an African-American community and left it without any services. A tornado hit that community and housings were. I am talking to you about how compounded issues, and then you have fear and anxiety coming from the highest level of our government. The anxiety that people are feeling, and I just told you about the youngest generations among us. How can Americans be growing up in a country with such abundance and grow up with such fear of each other and of its own government? And I will tell you, as service providers are also facing trauma. Yeah. And we need to provide them too, because we do not have the tools or the wherewithal. The deluge is coming too fast and furious. And as someone who is pushing forward an organization of this breadth, I worry who among our YWCAs is going to break. It's too much to bear. And we need some responses. The nonprofit community is picking up the pieces, and we do not have the resources coming from our federal government to pick these pieces up and put it together in a way that really showcases who we are as a nation.
Thank you so much. My time has expired. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I now recognize my esteemed colleague, the gentlelady from Texas, Representative Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the panel. It's really been almost heartbreaking hearing some of the testimony that you've presented this morning. And I really do appreciate the historical context and the real context on the ground. And hopefully people across America will better understand what is really going on in our country. The Trump administration's immigration policies have had a significant impact, not only here, but in migrant and border communities throughout our country, resulting in anti-immigrant rhetoric becoming common in public discourse. It's just too common in public discourse. We all acknowledge that there is a humanitarian crisis at the southern border, but many of us know that this is one in the president's own making. Migrants are enduring systemic human rights abuses. Children and adults alike are held in overcrowded processing pens, hungry and neglected. Families are being torn apart. More funds for these agencies only will fuel the perpetrators of abuse. Real change will require rescinding the policies causing the abuse, meaningful oversight, and a transformative approach to immigration law and policy. President Trump has described immigration at our southern border as an invasion of our country. The impact of such anti-immigrant rhetoric, regretfully, is not limited to El Paso or border communities. At a congressional hearing in May, the FBI head of the FBI's Counterterrorism Division testified that the Bureau was investigating 850, I'll repeat that, 850 domestic terrorism cases, and that of those, 40%, almost half, involved racially motivated extremists. So this is unfortunately not news. It's not made up, it's facts. So Dr. Muñoz, I wanted to start with you because I really found your written testimony to be quite enlightening. I actually thought I knew a lot of our history. I'm one of these people that, as the county attorney mentioned, that some of us are not as brown as others. I mean, look at me, yo soy buena. I could probably drive around and nobody would stop me. But that's the problem, isn't it? That it is based on color and it is based on race. And you actually say in your paper that this started back in the era, as the chairman asked you some questions. I mean, the number of lynchings that you cite in your paper between 1848 and 1928 was 547, half of which were in Texas almost, 232. It seems like Texas has always been like the training ground, the incubator, if you will, that starts a lot of this. County Attorney, you remember our flight. I see my colleague, a former colleague, Senator Rodriguez here, and this before. And, you know, what is it about Texas? What do we need to change?
Texas has a long history of white supremacy. I mean, it is a nation that has intersecting histories of slavery, of genocide, and of colonization, and it's actually layered histories of colonization. And if we remember, for example, that the Texas Revolution was inspired in large part so that Anglo settlers could own slaves. And so the policing regime that then was developed to quote unquote protect Anglo settlers from Mexicans who were living in Texas before.
We all know the Texas Rangers.
Right, the state police officers, they targeted Mexican residents. They allowed enslavement to continue by hunting people who tried to seek freedom by crossing into Mexico, and they participated in genocide. And so the policing, our institutions of policing in Texas have a deep history of racial violence, and that's something that as a community we have to reckon with. And one of the things that we can do is by truthfully.
So have we seen any change at all, or is the Trump rhetoric similar to the rhetoric and the climate back then?
It's unsettling how much of the rhetoric echoes. Certainly from members of the administration, from the president himself, but also from elected officials in Texas. The anti-immigrant sentiment, for too long, the humanitarian crisis has been represented. People who were seeking refuge in the United States, children especially, were described as terrorists. And as
Because when
cartel
you say your
members.
written testimony that there was public displays of the number of Mexicans murdered to show that things were in control, it kind of reminded me of the vice president's visit to the valley where, while many of us as members of Congress are even denied entry, we surely are not in there with TV cameras. But I just saw that as a public display to show their base. Look, we're taking a look at all of them. They're caged.
Absolutely, it's a performance and nation building.
It's the same thing, isn't it?
You can certainly look at the patterns and say, something that really alarms me is especially when I see representations of Latinos primarily being people who are under arrest or people who are being raided by ICE. When those are the representations of Latinos in this country, it enables other people to think that that's how Latinos should be treated, that they shouldn't be trusted, and that they should be fearful of them. And so certainly when I look at the historical photographs and representations of Latinos, people in Texas who were murdered, police officers posing next to dead bodies, I am deeply troubled by these representations.
Thank you. Apparently, I've run out of time. I heard her gavel me. I had a question for you, Ms. Bernal, but I'll ask you after the session.
Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
I'm so sorry to my colleague. I apologize. I now recognize my distinguished colleague from Colorado, the Representative Neguse.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing, and thank you for your leadership. Also, thank you to the El Paso community for being so welcoming to us members from various different parts of the country. I happen to be from Colorado, from the 2nd Congressional District, and it's great to be able to be here on my first trip to El Paso. Being here really gives members like myself the chance to see and hear for themselves the real-life impacts of the Trump administration's policies at the border and the effects of the anti-immigrant rhetoric coming from the White House. I think we all have an obligation and a responsibility to speak out against hatred and against bigotry and against violence in our communities. I was moved by the testimony of each of the witnesses. Dr. Muñoz, thank you for your very thoughtful tome, that I'm just on a very dark chapter. At the University of Colorado Boulder, my alma mater, and happen to represent that institution in Congress, there's a quote on the library from George Norland, who was a president of the university long ago, and essentially says, he or she who only knows his generation or her generation will always remain a child. And so the ability to learn from the past is incredibly important. Ms. Bernal, I was very moved by your testimony. I am a son of immigrants. My parents are from East Africa. Madam Chair referenced the S-hole comment that the president made several years ago, which was an outrage to me and to many folks in my community. But I also, my wife is Hispanic, and we have a 1-year-old daughter who is Latina. And your comment about your children is very profound. And I guess what I'm wondering is whether you can kind of expound on, I was struck yesterday, we went, my colleagues and I, Pramila and Representative Jayapal and Representative Escobar went to the memorial outside of the Walmart. And I was struck by the outpouring of support in this community. Afterwards, we went to dinner. I would be remiss if I didn't say Representative Escobar promised us that El Paso would have the best enchiladas in the country, and she was not. And they did, so she was not mistaken. But as we were driving to the restaurant, what struck me, I saw a group of children playing. It was a sports game, a baseball game. And clearly this community is rallying and is showing what we all have read about over the course of the last several weeks, which is this sort of embodiment of El Paso Strong. But I guess the question I have, Ms. Bernal, is as you talk to members of this community, part of our challenge is to convince hearts and minds. And how do you explain the importance to someone whom maybe disagrees with my worldview on immigration and the belief of the value of immigrants to this country and your worldview? How do we explain to them that the dehumanizing rhetoric that we hear from the White House and elsewhere has real consequences. How do you do that? I imagine you have many conversations here in this community.
Right, thank you for the question. That's a really hard, I think it's a really hard question. What I try to do, and what I encourage others to do is frankly what you all are doing, and thank you, Congresswoman, for inviting this committee here. I think that we can't ever accept any kind of hateful rhetoric as just the new normal. Sometimes it happens so much that it's exhausting to constantly push back on it. It's exhausting to constantly say that's not right and we shouldn't accept it. So I think what we need from you all and what we need from each of us is that constantly pushing back. We can't let it go. It's not normal and it's not right. But my frustration sometimes in speaking to people who try to generalize that it's an overreaction, right? That you can't draw the line, you can't tie the two together between violence and speech. And so what I try to do is reinforce, that the idea, I think, that with some hateful rhetoric when it started, a lot of people said, well, the rhetoric is directed at drug dealers, right? Those are those bad people. That's not us. Or it was directed at undocumented immigrants. Well, we're Americans, right? That wasn't directed at us. And so now what's the excuse, right? It was people in Walmart shopping for school supplies. And it didn't matter, there were people from other countries, but the person in looking to shoot brown people, he didn't stop to say, are you undocumented? He didn't stop to say, are you dangerous, right? You just happened to be there. So I think one of the messages in pushing back is that we're not talking about others. We're talking about you and your children and your mothers that are shopping in Walmart on that Saturday morning.
Thank you, Ms. Bernal, and I see my time has expired. I would just say you have my word, and I think you have the word of this committee, that we will continue to shine a light.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. I now recognize my distinguished colleague, the gentlewoman from Texas, Representative Lee. Jackson Lee, I apologize. I'm sorry.
Thank you. It's my privilege to be here again and to be here in the presence of my distinguished colleagues, and particularly, as I've indicated, but I want on the official congressional record, a powerful and effective leader in the United States Congress, in Congresswoman Escobar, and to again thank her for the time that I've come to El Paso, that I've had to walk across the border to discern what is going on, and her accommodations and her welcoming for us to be able to again understand the crisis that is here. And I want to acknowledge the fantastic working relationship that she's established with all members, and her former colleague, Beto O'Rourke, who was here as well, and our chairman. So thank you again for that. Let me try to be quick in my questioning. There's so much one wants to say, but let me read from a Times article on what is the definition. What does a terrorist look like? I'd ask unanimous consent to the chairwoman to put this into the record, dated August 19, 2019. Reading it,
Without
it says,
objection.
White supremacy is a greater threat than international terrorism right now. This is from a former U.S. attorney. I have to pursue a white supremacist with hate crimes unless he interfaces with Al-Qaeda. Does that make sense? And I asked my county attorney on that. We do not have a construct right now that allows us to deal with domestic terrorism. That is a task that the Judiciary Committee is going to take up immediately. And I would welcome your comments on the importance of that, because I loved my colleague from Colorado saying hate is too much of a burden, and he's right. We must act with love. But to prosecute properly these heinous acts of terrorism from El Paso to Mother Emanuel, to the Pulse nightclub, among others, to Christchurch, which is another country, There has to be a different construct. And I just want to remind not El Paso, but the nation of the pain. These are hardworking workers who were experiencing this heinous act in Walmart. Of course, Walmart has done its own policies, which all corporate America can. One of the things they can do is to cease the manufacturers of guns and ammunition from funding the National Rifle Association. They can stop that right now. Because it is not a partisan issue that we're discussing here. It is to protect American citizens. And I have great respect for my Republican colleagues, but I wish they had come not because it's Democrats or Republicans, not because there was a heinous act in El Paso, but because we care about America's safety and security. I want to go to the county attorney, and I asked for pithiness just because I'm trying to get to all three of you, but I was appalled at the scene that I could just imagine of federal officers coming into a courtroom and dragging a domestic violence person out. Please tell me what that means. The collective body of immigration officials who I've worked with, who are passionate men and women, who have been reconstructed because of the policies of the commander-in-chief. What is that like? How chilling effect is that? County Attorney Bernal.
Thank you for the question. It was, in fact, quite chilling and stunning to everyone that was in the courtroom. One of the most disturbing parts of it is that at the time, our Congresswoman was the county judge, and we did complain to federal authorities. And we were told that a complaint or an investigation would be made by the Inspector General, and we were never informed on the outcome of that investigation. So we don't know if there were any consequences. But I think that one of the things that the Congress can do to really help is exactly what you're talking about. The law has to change in accordance with our changing standards and the changing conditions of our country.
I thank you. Let me ask both Dr. Muñoz Martinez, who is an alum, and Ms. Castillo. I have to get my questions in so you can answer them before the clock. Your concept of violence and how there was a fight on the border, you open up that history of Mexico and border Anglos trying to retain control. But the point is how that translates into some people's minds about continuing that schism. And Ms. Castillo, the YMCA has been enormously powerful in dealing with hate, but dealing with bringing communities together. What is that instruction? Both of you can answer first and second. Thank you.
Well, really quickly, I'll just say that this wasn't Anglos who were trying to protect the border from Mexicans who were trying to invade. This was Anglos who were trying to claim a place in the border where they were new. Right. So they were actually trying to displace longstanding Mexican-American communities that had formerly been a part of Mexico, Tejanos who had deep roots. But they were being portrayed, these citizens, these residents were being portrayed as the invaders, as people who were untrustworthy. And so part of the hard work is breaking through those representations to see what's actually at work in that violence.
That's why I wanted you to clarify for me or for the record. And that carries forward sometimes in some thinking. Is that correct?
Absolutely, especially when I see border communities like El Paso, where people live biculturally, binationally, and They have another imagination of what it means to live on the border. And for that to be attacked is something that is deeply troubling because it's a pattern, it's a historical pattern.
So we need to pierce that hatred, that kind of nationalism on the part of white nationalists and others. Ms. Castillo, thank you so very much.
And Congresswoman, you know our history well, but just to answer your question, we empower women, but we know that in order for us to empower women, we have to address race. So for us, making sure that we address racism and we uplift women of color has always been paramount to us. And as we think about how our country and the racism that is being kind of fueled and the rhetoric that's coming together, particularly with regard to immigration, our focus is making sure that we address racism, we talk about racism, but we also act upon racism. And our YWCAs are a safe place for that conversation, for that healing, and we have a multitude of programs and a multitude of activities to bring communities together. Just last night, we actually held a community healing process. We had over 200 community members here in El Paso, led by our YWCA, and I have just beautiful anecdotes and conversations that members of the community brought together. So I would love to submit that to the committee.
Please do. I'd like to join you in Houston if I could on that kind of program.
Absolutely.
With that, I want to thank the committee chairwoman for indulgence, and I yield back.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Jackson-Lee. This concludes the first panel of today's hearing. I'd like to thank all of our distinguished witnesses on the first panel for participating in this hearing. We are going to take a very brief recess. We're just going to switch out a couple things. So if you have to leave the room for a health break, you'll have to make it quick. And we will stand in recess for 5 minutes. Our first is Shaw Drake. Shaw joined the American Civil Liberties Union of Texas Border Rights Center as policy counsel last year. In his current role, he is responsible for developing border-related advocacy strategies, working closely with other ACLU border affiliates and ACLU National. Prior to joining the ACLU, Mr. Drake served as law clerk for the Honorable James Ornstein in the Eastern District of New York and an Equal Justice Works Fellow at Human Rights First, where he authored the report, Crossing the Line, U.S. Border Agents Illegally Reject Asylum Seekers. Mr. Drake received his BA from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and his JD from the Georgetown University Law Center. Next, we have Linda Rivas. She is the executive director at Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center, where she serves the needs of asylum seekers and the immigrant and refugee community in El Paso, West Texas, and New Mexico. In 2016, Ms. Rivas also helped create the Borderland Immigration Council, a local group of attorney and advocacy groups formed to help address issues in the immigration system. Ms. Rivas was born in Mexico and raised in El Paso. She received her BA from the University of Texas at El Paso and her JD from Loyola College of Law in New Orleans. Then we have Fernando Garcia. Fernando is the founder and executive director of the Border Network for Human Rights, an organization that seeks to facilitate the education, the organizing, and the participation of marginalized border communities to defend and promote human and civil rights. As director, Fernando is responsible for facilitating the creation of human rights community-based committees and the training of human rights promoters in southern New Mexico, West Texas, Arizona, Houston, Dallas, San Jose, California, and New Jersey. Previously, Mr. Garcia served as the national coordinator of the National Movement for Legalization and Human Rights from 2001 to 2006. He studied political science and Mexican archaeology at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. We welcome all of our distinguished witnesses on this second panel and thank them for participating in today's hearing. Now, if you would please rise, I will begin by swearing you in. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record show the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and you may be seated. Please note that each of your written statements will be entered into the record in its entirety. I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes, and just as we did with the first panel, we will have an iPad right over here helping us keep track of time, and our staff will be timing you on that iPad, and we'll raise it up when you have 1 minute remaining. Mr. Shaw, you may begin.
Your microphone. Try it.
Try it again? No.
Is it a right, red light?
The little red light is on.
Red light's on.
Oh,
there we
you
go.
Okay.
Thank you. Chair Escobar, Chairman Nadler, esteemed members of the subcommittee, thank you for the honor of appearing before you today, and thank you for coming to El Paso to hear firsthand the devastating realities playing out each day for so many along our border. I have the privilege of serving as attorney and policy counsel for the American Civil Liberties Union's Border Rights Center based here in El Paso, Texas. We at the Border Rights Center stand with border communities to defend and protect the United States constitutional guarantees of equality and justice for all, to live freely, safely, and with dignity. Border communities want border policies that respect the culture and people who have lived here for generations, as well as newcomers to the region. Since taking office, the Trump administration has attacked the border and immigrants from every angle, attempting to implement an array of policy changes under a clear goal: keep immigrants of color out of the United States, and do so at all costs, no matter the violation to constitutional rights or basic decency that follows. First, it is very important to make clear the civil rights challenges along our border neither begin nor end with Trump. President Trump inherited a deterrence and enforcement-only approach to border policy and found in Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, a rogue agency free from accountability measures and ready to carry out his anti-immigrant agenda. CBP's culture of cruelty has been on national display in recent months, but not because of the agency's own mechanisms for accountability or transparency. It took leaked screenshots to reveal the private Facebook group where agents posted racist and sexually violent content. It took text messages revealed in court for one Border Patrol agent's lawyer to argue his client's statement that migrants were, quote, disgusting subhuman shit was commonplace and part of the agency's culture. It took our complaints at the ACLU to the Office of Inspector General and subsequent investigations to reveal CBP was holding migrants, including children, for prolonged periods in dangerously overcrowded and inhumane conditions. It took years of ACLU litigation to reveal 30,000 pages of documents detailing shocking violence and abuse by CBP agents against children dating back to 2009. Much of Trump's immigration administration's policy changes along the border have focused on limiting or obstructing the ability of migrants to seek asylum in the United States. Instead of people finding safety and refuge, thousands subjected to Trump's policies have been consequently kidnapped, extorted, raped, and even killed in Mexico. Not only are we ignoring our legal obligations, we are literally turning our backs on those seeking safety and refuge at our door. This administration has dramatically expanded the use of metering, the practice of turning away asylum seekers, and severely limiting the number allowed to enter the United States at ports of entry. In July 2018, CBP turned away the Castro family, including their 3 children, leading to a 6-month-long ordeal in Mexico where they experienced gang-related threats, extortion, and were later kidnapped. Only after ACLU and congressional intervention were they processed. There are currently over 26,000 such asylum seekers on metering lists waiting in northern Mexico. In addition, there is now 40,000 asylum seekers, including babies and children with disabilities, returned to Mexico under the Remain in Mexico policy, officially known as the Migration Protection Protocols. The region of Mexico to which migrants are being returned are among the most dangerous in the world, and documented cases reveal the devastating violence suffered after being returned under MPP. The US government's border policies are not only impacting recently arrived populations, but everyday lives of those who call the border home. CBP claims exceptional authority within 100 miles of any international boundary, which encompasses 2/3 of the United States population. Agents, nevertheless, cannot pull anyone over without reasonable suspicion of an immigration violation or crime. Yet FOIA documents stemming from ACLU litigation reveal that Border Patrol is training its agents that facts such as, quote, whether the passenger appeared dirty can be used to justify a stop. Our country should be a place where everyone can travel freely to visit loved ones or seek medical assistance. The abuse of this administration cannot be fixed overnight, but if Congress is committed to addressing the underlying causes of Trump's violations at the border, it must shift immigration policy away from a deterrence-based, enforcement-only system to one that acknowledges humanitarian realities. US immigration and border policies must be rooted in civil liberties and civil and human rights. This includes providing due process to those arriving in the country, safeguarding access to asylum protections, bringing transparency and accountability to CBP, the nation's largest law enforcement agency, ending border militarization that harms border residents and migrants, and not giving DHS one more dime or detention bed. Border communities, including El Paso, have borne the brunt of Trump's cruelty-first approach. Border residents are looking to Congress to provide critical oversight of DHS, cut funding to CBP and ICE, and pass legislation to undo and redress the damage done by this administration, while making structural changes to ensure this abuse never happens again. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Shah. Ms. Rivas.
Thank you, Chairwoman Escobar, Chairman Nadler. Thank you so much to this esteemed committee for traveling to El Paso, Texas. For the past 5 years, I have had the honor to serve at Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center. Las Americas is a local nonprofit organization dedicated to serving the needs of migrants, specializing in asylum seekers for the past 32 years. We are unwavering in our passion and in our mission, and this year, that conviction forced us to travel to Mexico in order to continue helping asylum seekers under the harmful Remain in Mexico policy. For years, we had worked to strengthen programs in our detention centers. We currently are helping we currently represent the same hunger strikers that Chairwoman Escobar described today. But our resources had to be diverted to remain in Mexico. Less than a week after the ill-named Migrant Protection Protocol had been rolled out, Las Americas' phone started ringing off the hook. Our inclusion on a DOJ list, which I provided the committee today, was provided by DHS, and it was through this that they were able to call Las Americas. In 23 weeks, we have been able to capture over 600 phone calls. Those are only the ones that we have been able to answer and register. 80% of the people who have called us report a fear of being in Mexico. We have been able to conduct with very little resources over 300 legal intakes across the border. We have successfully released 40 people from MPP based on vulnerabilities or fear to return in Mexico. And we have taken on 10 cases for full legal representation thus far. We have witnessed 9 pregnant women be subjected to be returned to Mexico, although they were over 7 months pregnant. We have witnessed 3 victims of rape, not raped by one, but raped by multiple men. We have also represented a woman who was they attempted to rape her in front of her 3-year-old child. That woman was sent back to Mexico, despite our best efforts. She decided to give up her asylum claim and go home. I have not heard from her since. One day, a man, US citizen from Miami, came to our office frantic. He needed help for his sister, a 44-year-old deaf and nonverbal woman who had been returned to Mexico under MPP. How can we justify a deaf, nonverbal woman being returned to Mexico? Border Patrol confirmed to me that an interpreter was never secured for her. Within less than 48 hours, Las Americas sprung into action. We were in Mexico, and the next day we represented her in court. While we successfully removed her from the program, we still have to consider that her brother and his family thought that she was dead for several weeks because of the inability to communicate with her. I have now, unfortunately, had to meet not one, but 2 mothers who have been returned to Mexico with children with congenital heart issues. One mother, after being sent back more than once, was eventually let out. The other, that I just met the other day, has a son. When he is hyperactive, his lips turn purple. She was able to visit one doctor in Mexico, and the pastor from that same shelter paid for that medical care. They do not have a plan if the little boy were to lose consciousness. Just yesterday, I spoke to a client. Her case is on September 30th. We have been ready for trial now for several weeks. The day before trial, my client's house was raided for drugs. So her trial was continued to September 30th. But yesterday we spoke and she said, "Abogada, ya no puedo." Attorney, I just can't anymore. She's reached her end. She's reached her breaking point. This woman was returned to Mexico since April. She was kidnapped once for ransom. She was let go. She tried to live in a hotel. The hotel was almost robbed, with her living with other single mothers and young children. And she took a non-refoulement interview 3 times and did not pass. She's finally reached her wit's end. Her child was diagnosed with childhood anorexia, but the doctor says it could be something else, but there is not enough money for them to conduct more tests. It doesn't matter that I'm her attorney. It doesn't matter that we're ready to go to court. She's given up. She will be leaving on a bus Tuesday of next week. I will end with, Remain in Mexico is not a representation of the beauty of this binational community. While hope does emerge from El Paso and Juarez, as it always does, the dangers that migrants face are so real that the shelter owners that help them ask migrants not to leave, not to talk in public, and to hide in order to remain safe. As we know, hiding is not acceptable under US or international law. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Garcia.
Buenos días, Chairwoman Escobar, Chairman Adler, and all members of the Subcommittee on Immigration and Citizenship. I thank you for coming down to El Paso. Today, I'm not representing myself, but more than 1,000 families that live in New Mexico in El Paso area. My testimony will touch on 3 points. The first, on the growth of the border and immigration enforcement apparatus. The second, on the impacts of social enforcement in our communities. And thirdly, a reflection on how to move forward with a good and better narrative for the future of America. During the last 30 years, since Operation Blockade in the early 1990s, our border from San Diego to Brownsville has become one of the most militarized borders in the world. Administrations of both parties have thrown our community under the bus for political gains. By 2018, CBP alone had a budget of $14 billion for border enforcement. Today, more than 23,000 Border Patrol agents are deployed between ports of entry and within our communities. We had more than 700 miles of fencing and walls, 12,000 underground sensors, 170 aircrafts and 8 drone systems in our skies, 84 water vessels, nearly 500 surveillance systems, 9,000 vision goggles, 6,000 thermal technology, dozens of immigration checkpoints and detention centers, dozens of National Guard elements and active duty troops. All of this enforcement, of course, that has an impact in our community. As for the 2010 census, 14 million Americans live within 100 miles of the border. This is not an empty, barren place, but this is a thriving community full of life. Border Patrol checkpoints entrap people in our communities. One of our community leaders has a degenerative liver disease that can only be treated in San Antonio or Houston, but she cannot travel for surgery because she cannot pass the checkpoints. This region seems the only place in America where constitutional rights do not exist. Immigration enforcement agencies feel that they can do anything to our community with complete disregard of our rights. We see excessive use of force, sometimes lethal, against immigrant families and border residents. Agents enter properties and search homes without proper warrants. Agents use racism and racial profiling to stop, question, and detain people. Violations of the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment rights have become the norm. Additionally, an average of 500 migrants die every year looking for the American dream. Since 1993, more than 10,000 immigrants have perished in the deserts, mountains, and rivers of our border region. Today, border communities live in fear of the enforcement institutions that are supposed to protect them. We are subjected to a culture of abuse imposed by the harsh reality of detention, searches, and arrests without merit. The U.S. has built the largest domestic enforcement operations with a safeguards for effective accountability or oversight. This is not a question if we need enforcement at the border, but a question of what type of enforcement do we want. Making agencies to be accountable, respect our rights, know the Constitution, stop separating families. All of this is the right and the just thing to do, and in keeping with our nation's values. Accountability to the community and transparency in their actions is not only a mandate, but a moral obligation. I commend Congresswoman Escobar for introducing H.R. 2203, the Homeland Security Improvement Act, which brings the necessary accountability measures to border enforcement institutions. These include an oversight commission made up of border residents that can investigate and evaluate enforcement strategies and practices, an ombudsman to oversee CBP, ICE, and USCIS, improvements in the complaint process, training rooted in civil, constitutional, and human rights. We know that American government works best with check and balances I encourage you to review it and to support it. In our history, border has been defined by the characters of the nation, have defined the character of their nation, of our nations. It was the Statue of Liberty in the Ellis Island that represented the best ideas of America. This border here today is where the future of America will be shaped. We know that the US-Mexico border can and must be the new Ellis Island of our era. The families arriving in El Paso today have the same hopes, aspirations, and dreams as those teeming masses at Ellis Island a century ago. Today, we must decide what kind of America we want, decide what our future will be. Will America incarcerate families, put children in jails, build walls, let immigration agencies act with impunity, or America would accept its destiny as a nation of immigrants that is exceptional because of its inclusivity, diversity, and commitment to each other? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very powerful testimony. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. I have been shocked in listening to this administration as they have denied the horrific conditions that migrants face in Mexico, and that they have championed MPP as some kind of victory in alleviating humanitarian concerns, when in fact, all that this country has done is take the misery that has arrived at our front door and shoved it into our neighbor's yard. Those of us here in this community, not only do we see the misery, but we can hear it. So without objection, I would like to enter the following articles into the record as evidence for the administration that people are suffering in danger. The first is, I'm in danger. Migrant parents face violence in Mexico under new Trump policy. The next is, Trump's Remain in Mexico policy exposes migrants to rape, kidnapping, and murder in dangerous border cities. And the third is, Central American migrants plead to seek asylum in US, not Mexico. To our attorneys on the panel, you have detailed examples of the dangers faced by migrants when they are MPP'd. But I think it's important for the American public to understand the challenges for due process and the challenges you face as legal advocates who have clients that have been sent to Mexico. So Mr. Drake and Ms. Rivas, if you wouldn't mind with the remaining 3 minutes and 30 seconds sharing that time to detail that for the American public.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I'll start by saying the ACLU, just days after the implementation of MPP, filed a class action nationwide lawsuit against the program in California because this program is blatantly and completely illegal. It is a program that it is meant to cut off asylum seekers from their legal right to seek asylum in the United States. It denies them access to counsel, and it ignores a robust set of legislation passed by Congress for the handling of arriving asylum seekers at our border. That includes a process to ensure that we are meeting our international and domestic legal obligations to ensure that we are not returning people to situations of ongoing persecution. And what MPP does is precisely that. It returns people to ongoing persecution in Mexico and it exposes them to onward return to their home countries. So as a baseline matter, it is completely illegal. What we have seen through our plaintiffs and through our documentation of the program since its inception is, as those articles detail and as the Congresswoman has explained, every migrant returned to Mexico under MPP is subjected to a heightened risk of violence and abuse. There is not enough shelters to house them. The Mexican government cannot provide protection even if they tried. Migrants are a targeted group in Mexico for kidnapping and extortion. Groups that, I think it was just reported today, that groups such as Cubans are at even heightened risk of being targeted because they're perceived as having money. So what the Trump administration is doing is fueling organized crime's ability to take further advantage of this population.
And Ms. Rivas, could you tell us how hard is it for you as a lawyer to provide legal counsel to someone in another country?
It's incredibly difficult. We do not have office space in Mexico. We do not have the resources to acquire office space in Mexico. We are relying on unofficial relationships that we have with NGOs that happen to be in Mexico. One NGO, VIA, Derechos Humanos Integrales en Acción, was the first nonprofit to offer us a space. One day from walking from a governmental state office, the CAIM, Centro de Atención Integral al Migrante, it's essentially a center for migrant services, and I walked to VIA. After 30 minutes later, there was a shooting in the same path that me and my colleagues had walked as we were conducting intakes that day. This was prior to August 3rd. I will say that I was definitely not used to ever having to deal with gun violence in El Paso, Texas, and being there in Ciudad Juarez, it was very chilling as an attorney to have to deal with that. In addition to that, long wait times take me away from the office, takes me away from other clients, takes me away from court preparation, to have to wait in line. One time to have to be subjected to secondary inspection. This is a huge challenge for us. And the reason that I provided this called List of Pro Bono Legal Service Providers that actually comes from the DOJ, from EOIR, is because this continuously is given to migrants that are placed in MPP by Border Patrol, by CPP, and by the judges. Sometimes repeatedly, the same list is given over and over. And the reason this is so important is because of these 4 people on the list for the non-detained court. We are the only nonprofit agency that is regularly traveling to Mexico to conduct legal intake and to help people that are in MPP. Others on this list are open to taking cases, but they are not actually traveling into Mexico. And I think that's just very, very important for us to realize.
Thank you so much. Before I move on, I will be entering without objection 3 additional articles, just as we try to deal with and face atrocities of one Trump administration policy. Another one is always right around the corner. The most recent one is the assault on the Flores settlement agreement. So I'd like to enter into the record, Trump faces long shot bid to jail migrant families indefinitely. 3 reasons why the new Flores rule does not pass legal muster, and immigration advocate weighs in on Trump administration's move to end Flores agreement. With that, I now recognize our chairman, the gentleman from New York, Representative Nadler.
Thank you very much. Mr. Drake, you spoke about the MPP program being illegal, and I think you've challenged it in court. What is the current legal status of that challenge?
So we want a nationwide injunction finding the program illegal. The Ninth Circuit has stayed that injunction, allowing the program to proceed while the Court of Appeals considers the merits of the injunction. 2 out of the 3 judges that reviewed the initial stay request by the government actually agreed with our legal arguments that the program is illegal. Nevertheless, they've allowed it to go forward at least until the next hearing in October, when the Court of Appeals will hear the merits of that injunction.
So that's nationwide?
Yes.
Okay. And the committee has been greatly concerned about CBP's attempts to restrict the number of people seeking asylum at ports of entry through metering. It obviously makes little sense to encourage people to seek asylum at ports of entry. Don't use illegal entry. Go to the ports of entry and then make them wait weeks or months to make their claim. The ACLU Border Rights Center sent a letter to the El Paso Port Director expressing concerns about port hardening, and the closure of ports of entry is a way to avoid its lawful duty to process asylum seekers, particularly Mexican nationals. According to your letter, CBP has even closed the entire port on some days, not just metered, but just closed them. My question is, has CBP responded, and what justifications has CBP provided for these operations?
The only public justification that CBP...
Have they responded to your letter?
They have not.
Okay, go ahead.
We hope they do.
And when was your letter sent?
Our letter was sent on Wednesday of this week.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Give them a few more days. Yes, so CBP, the only public justification CBP has provided for closing ports is the arrival of quote-unquote large groups of migrants. Information that we've received from at least one of those closures indicate that supposed large group of migrants was a group of 20 Mexican families, including children, asylum seekers, who are approaching the port of entry to assert their lawful right to seek asylum in the United States. More broadly, we have great concern around the port hardening. Any border barrier, razor wire, walls, all stand as a symbol of xenophobic, the xenophobic rhetoric of this presidency. And the port hardening, as CBP calls it, is another example of that. It also spews fear in the community and can be seen as an effort to turn local populations against the arriving immigrants, because it creates a great deal of hardship for those who cross our border every day.
And what has been the impact in border communities of the border hardening of the metering?
We've seen extremely long wait lines to enter the country. Thousands of people cross these ports of entry in the El Paso sector every day to go to school and work and visit family members, and now face hour-long delays because CBP has restricted traffic down to one lane or closed the ports for many hours. The other concern is that every border crosser is crossing through what is clearly a militarized zone with razor wire, which perpetuates, again, this idea of fear and of an invasion that simply does not exist.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. Let me turn to you. Can you describe the change in numbers of Border Patrol personnel over the past 25 years in the El Paso area? And also, have you observed any change in the character, the way they behave?
Well, you know, I think we had seen the numbers being tripled in the last 23 years. And when we say that, is that every time when we had an immigration reform discussion in Congress, 2006, 2013, we didn't get immigration reform, but we get more enforcement. Every time we got more Border Patrol agents, the border, so at this point, as I mentioned, we had more than 23,000 of them. And the behavior, it depends on the region of the border. In El Paso, we had developed a good relationship with Border Patrol because we had engaged our communities and our institutions with Border Patrol and make them accountable. But that accountability is gone for the last 2 years. So the Trump administration has destroyed any good relationship.
By doing what?
Community.
By doing what?
By curtailing the engagement with communities. We used to have regular meetings with Border Patrol. In the past, in the last 2 years, that is actually that hasn't happened. There is more incidents of abuses being reported in our community than before, to numbers that we didn't see for many, many, many years. So I think that is a major shift, especially in the last 2 years.
And let's see, my time has expired. Well, let me just ask one more. How the personnel additions, the additions in numbers, impacted the border communities?
Well, I think you had two different levels. One of them, it is that you see more Border Patrol members within our communities. They used to say that Border Patrol was only to protect the borderline, but that is not happening any longer. I mean, we see them within the 100 miles of the border, and that is impacting in a ways that we had seen this before. I mean, illegal entries into property, questioning children, high school children, students, in numbers that we had not seen before. So I think that is, and the numbers would matter, but would matter less if they would be trained and they would have some more accountability processes and mechanisms to be accountable to. And we don't have those at the border. There's no formal mechanisms to actually make Border Patrol responsible for their actions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
I
Chairman.
yield back.
I now recognize the gentlewoman from Washington, Representative Jayapal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all for your very, very powerful testimony, and more importantly, thank you for your work. You really are on the front lines. Yesterday, I observed the MPP court. I was there for about an hour and a half, and I had not observed an MPP court before. I've seen lots of other immigration courtrooms, and I think it is an absolute outrage that we call it a protection protocol, because there is no protection for the migrants that are there. And, you know, the judges are trying to do the best they can, but about 250 to 300, I think, yesterday on the docket, Ms. Rivas, I saw them handing out these sheets. I looked at the sheets. I saw that there were 4 on there. Now I know that there's only one that actually travels into Mexico. Thank you for doing that. But I watched and listened over the course of an hour and a half as almost every single, I think there was one person in the hour and a half that we were there that we observed in 2 different courtrooms that had an attorney, that had representation. And there was the judge saying over and over again, I can give you a continuance, can you try to find an attorney? And each person was saying, I've tried, there are no attorneys, I've called, there's nobody here. And even at the points when they were asked, do you have a fear of returning to Mexico? Some of them raised their hands. Many of them said, you know, at least one person said, you know, very definitively, I don't even want my interview because nobody listens to me. Nobody is going to believe that I have a fear of returning. And so it is a terrible situation, not to mention we were told by the court officials that MPP has taken over the court proceedings. So they are now moving all the other cases that those courts should be considering to 2020, September of 2020. And each of these people that are coming in potentially getting a continuance, but then they have to stay here, they have to return to Mexico 3 months, they're coming back, women in the courtroom with babies, crying babies. And so I say all of that because I think it's important, this community knows, but hopefully we can get this information out beyond El Paso with this hearing. I wanted to ask Mr. Drake, because one of the arguments that's made that is absolutely false, and I want you to refute it for me if you will, I hope you can, I believe you can, is that this is the surge that's coming across that's required this, and there is no other way to deal with this. And so tell us, Mr. Drake, how we've had surges in the past, tell us the process that used to happen to process people in humane ways prior to MPP, because it is possible to do that. We don't need these policies, and I just would like you to tell us exactly what used to happen.
Sure, I'll start by saying that although there was a surge in recent months of numbers, we are still well below historic highs of border crossers. There was well over 1 million border crossers annually back in the early 2000s, at a time when the agency, I believe, had half the budget and 1/3 the personnel. And so with an agency that has more than doubled in size, is now faced with handling an even smaller population than they did in the past. What has shifted is the number of families entering, but the administration has known about that shift in numbers since 2013. And again, this is a group of people who are crossing the border seeking out U.S. agents. They are not single adults attempting to evade inspection, and in fact, many, as we've heard, want to go to ports of entry and actually present themselves. And so there is a broad set of immigration laws to process arriving asylum seekers, including IRA that was passed in 1997. There is massive due process problems with that law, but there are robust laws on the books that Congress passed with an understanding that these are an attempt at respecting our U.S. and international obligations to ensure that people aren't returned to danger. You know, immigration courts have famously been said to be death penalty cases tried in traffic court. Right. And I would say that MPP hearings, you know, provide even a less degree of access to due process and to counsel than any other court in the nation. And certainly is not the way to handle the arriving population.
It's a bit of a sham, really, because you're in a courtroom, but you don't get representation, incredibly complex law. I wanted to enter, Madam Chair, into the record the Women's Refugee Commission report, actually filing of a complaint documenting 20 cases of MPP family separations. In many cases, parents were reunited with their children months later after obtaining legal counsel. I seek unanimous consent to enter that into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. And in my remaining 1 second, I wanted to ask Ms. Rivas, you know, what is the, out of the 400, I think you said, calls that you've taken, did I get that number right? How many people can you actually represent given your staff and your resources?
The reality is very little. 10 is really pushing it at this point. Unfortunately, of those, some have decided to go back home. But just to kind of really paint the picture for you, our staff grew in response to family separation. and in response to horrific detention center conditions and prolonged detention. And when we have a partnership with the Southern Poverty Law Center that expands our capabilities to serve people in the detention center, we're thinking, we're finally, we're not going to be the scrappy nonprofit anymore. We're going to be built up. Then MPP hits. And then suddenly the attorneys that we were able to secure for the detention program, we can't do MPP. So I found myself having to go myself because I'm the director and I'm not under any specific grant. And so I said, okay, we're going to do this. And so the reality is no, very little. We don't have the resources for it. And we found ourselves as a community also saying, MPP has to come to an end, and we need to be calling for an end. So if we start expanding resources and writing grants, are we acquiescing to this program that this administration has thrust upon us? So we've been in an incredibly difficult position as a community. And the reality is that although we are one, and although we have registered 600 phone calls and we've conducted 300 intakes, we're not able to take many of those cases.
Thank you, Ms. Rivas, and thank you again to all of you for your work. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first, let me just say thank you to the lawyers. Often when people talk about lawyers, it's really not good things that they say about us. So speaking as a lawyer, and I know there's some lawyers at the table, and certainly let's hear it for the lawyers, everybody. They're doing a good job. And quite frankly, these days on many of our issues, Mr. Drake, we count on you and the ACLU and a number of other legal rights advocacy groups to go to the federal courts to try to undo some of the damage that's being done. I know you've studied in Latin America. You know the situation in a lot of those countries. Regrettably, we have a president who just thinks that that's all fake news and that everything down there is hunky-dory and people are just coming here for a spring break. Tell us, if you had to just try to explain to someone, middle America across this country, on why people flee, 25 words or less, just get to the bottom line. Why are people coming to our country?
They're coming to our country because staying at home means a certain imminent threat to the lives of themselves or to their children, and not leaving is simply not an option.
It's not an option. It's life or death, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And Mr. Garcia, and by the way, Garcia is a great name. You have visited and talked to a lot of people who come for those very reasons, haven't you?
Yes.
And there's some people who actually think that detention centers are better positioned than what they were, what they're fleeing. Some commentators, conservative commentators on Fox News have even said, it's like summer camp. They get everything they need. They're being taken care of. What are you hearing here on the ground? Tell us a few stories to convince the American people that what we describe is not fake news. It is happening.
It is not true. Actually, we had interviewed several families, both in Juarez and in El Paso, about the conditions in detention centers, and we released a report about that. You have it in in my testimonial as an attachment. What we had documented is situations that we had never seen and experienced for many years at the border or in the interior. For example, the fact that one kid was asking for milk, and there were bottles of milk there in one of these Border Patrol stations. And one of the agents, they just throw the milk to the dirt without giving that milk to that child. That was extreme. We had another situation with, again, Border Patrol and ICE officers gather people in the courtyard of the detention center with a hose. They just water people because they were bathing them collectively. We never, with the clothes on, we never hear situations like that before. Or just throwing children and families in what is called hieleras, these extreme cold rooms. where they get actually sick. When they are released, and they can also, our friends can present testimonies, many of them actually are released sick with colds and with other kind of diseases because the conditions that were there. So I think it is extreme. We never thought that we would see this in America. And they themselves, they are seeing that the conditions in those detention centers sometimes were even worse than the conditions in their own countries.
Right. Can I ask you just real quickly, do you think it's worse in for-profit detention centers versus nonprofit detention centers?
It is because, I mean, at least we think that there's a level of accountability for those detention centers run by the government.
Correct.
I mean, we need more than that. I mean, that's what I'm advocating for that.
I agree
but
with you.
when you have private detention centers with no accountability, they don't have to report in many of these cases what are the conditions that they are living. We had also received letters from people within the detention centers, private detention centers, explaining the conditions about the quality of food, medication, water. It is extremely terrible.
Right. I visited both, quite a few on private and for-profit, I mean, nonprofit, and I think I agree with you. And Ms. Rivas, for you, are the immigrants being treated any better or worse in Mexico once they go back to Mexico or sent back to Mexico?
That's a great question. I have had the ability to tour the tents on the Mexican side of the border. And I have to say that I just found myself wondering, I'm just going to be very honest with you. 150 people are returned under MPP at a time, sometimes more. And what they've done with their tents is there's no sleeping space, there's just chairs. There's chairs, there's fans, there's fresh fruit, there's water, there's porta potties that frankly do not smell. You're in a pretty clean area under these tents on the Mexican side of the border. And I found myself wondering, how is it that the Mexican government is able to process so many people? They get processed, they get their Mexican, it's called an FMM, their Mexican visa. And I found myself wondering, how is it that they do this process in a way that's pretty efficient in comparison to us having people sleep under bridges as they did in March? Many of the people that I encountered in MPP at the very beginning, in April, the very beginning weeks of this, had described sleeping under that bridge. They described sleeping on rocks. They described having the children sleep on top of their bodies so that the children wouldn't have to sleep on rocks, gravel, dirt, construction material, is what they told me. What you see in Mexico is a ton of resilience. Shelter system, well, not a shelter system, unofficial shelters that are just trying to pull themselves together, do the best that they can. People starting to rent homes, people living in hotels. It's not okay. They're essentially doing the absolute best they can. But what I see, what I witness, is in many ways Mexico is doing the work that the United States should be doing, in a way that is as dignified as possible. It's far from perfect, but it's something that we frankly should be ashamed of, to not meet our international obligations.
Well, I think there's a lot of shame to spread around in on many of these cruel policies. So thank you for the work that you're doing, and to all of you. Yield back.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I would associate myself with the remarks of Representative Garcia in terms of thanking you all as a lawyer, the work that you all are doing each and every day and touching immeasurable lives here and across the state of Texas and really across the country. And so I thank you for that. One of the reasons why these field hearings are so incredibly productive, in my view, is we get to learn new things that I didn't necessarily know before, but also it underscores some of the necessity in terms of the legislation that we're considering that I believe we ought to move forward on. And, Mr. Garcia, you mentioned Representative Escobar's Homeland Security Improvement Act, which I couldn't agree with you more, and think we ought to proceed with a floor vote on that bill when we return from our work period. And with respect to your point about for-profit detention, I couldn't agree more. I believe we need to eliminate for-profit detention entirely. We have a facility in Colorado that is for-profit. And of course, the Dignity in Detention Act with our champion, Representative Jayapal's legislation that she's introduced, I believe we also should move forward, and the Congress ought to move on that piece of legislation. So I thank you and every witness for underscoring that. There are two facts in your testimony, Mr. Drake, that I thought bear mentioning. They were in your written testimony, and for me, they were very striking. The first is, quote, "At least 12 migrants have died in CBP custody in the last year, including multiple children. Notably, there had not been a single death of a child in over a decade." That is a damning statement, and it demands the attention of this committee and of this Congress, and that's why we're here. I am wondering, I know this is a bit outside of the work that you're currently engaged in terms of the litigation with respect to the administration's recent MPP policy and so forth, but I had a chance to visit a number of facilities yesterday, including the facility at Clint. And at the time we visited, there were, I believe, 5 unaccompanied minors, unaccompanied children. And of course, this summer is the surge that you mentioned, tens of thousands of children being housed in this area and at that facility being detained. I guess the question I have, Mr. Drake, is where are those children now? And I understand that they were released into ORR custody, supposedly, but I guess does the ACLU have a good sense of what happened and where we go from here?
I think it would be hard to say that we have a good sense of how anything within CBP operates. We obviously were not aware until the Flores Council visited Clint the degree of abusive conditions that were being perpetrated against children. And I think it brings it back to the central point of accountability and transparency within the agency. We simply do not know where children are being held, how many are being held, and for what period they're being held. CBP does not release that data publicly or to members of Congress. There's examples of, Clint is a strong example of that we did not know of the number of children being held there. Congress, of course, didn't learn of the death of Jacqueline Call until many weeks later and until a news report broke that. And then it makes me think of the case of Carlos in the RGV who died on the floor of a Border Patrol station of flu symptoms and laid there on the floor with those symptoms for hours without any attention from an agent. And there has been no accountability for that death or any of the other 12 deaths in the past year, and certainly none for the death of children. And so, as you mentioned, legislation that that Congress should be looking at and moving forward, the Dr. Ruiz bill around the care of children, and then there needs to be robust legislation. Representative Escobar's bill is a step in the right direction, but there needs to be vast changes to how CBP operates and provides information to the public and provides access to detention facilities. Otherwise, we may never know where children are held and under what conditions they're held in.
Last question thank you, Mr. Drake. For Mr. Garcia, as I mentioned, there are facts that we learn that we didn't necessarily know before. I come from Colorado, which is a state very deep into the interior of the country, and so don't know that I necessarily fully appreciated the context in which El Paso is located and the integration of this broad community across an international border. And as we were driving up, my good colleague Representative Escobar pointing out that Juarez is just a few miles from here, from where we sit. In your testimony, Mr. Drake, you mentioned that Border Patrol's interior enforcement operations encroach deep into and across the country because of the 100-mile zone, and that almost 2/3 of the U.S. population lives within that 100-mile zone when you consider the entire
Hey, yep. Yes. Hey, yep. Good, how's it going? Okay. Okay, sounds good. No problem, thank you. Yep, I can hear you. Okay, sounds good. Have you guys changed topics on me? Hello? Which is on the guns and like, okay, great. Thanks. I think they're doing it. I'll text them though. I will tell them that. Let's see. Pan. Yep. Pan left and tilt down. I'm texting it to them now. Okay, hold the shot, please. Got it. That's why I asked the question about whether or not you changed the topic. Nope, no worries.